Tansi, Sego, Anin, Hello, Jordan Carina Sikosan, Egwa, Treaty 4, specifically Regina, Saskatchewan, Onitia, and a member of Pipot First Nation. Bogo, Hamilton, Ontario, for the past 20 years, Niguin Miigwets. My name is Jordan Carrier, and I'm originally from Treaty 4, Regina, Saskatchewan, and a member of Pipot First Nation. But now I live in Hamilton, Ontario, for the past 20 years. You are listening to the One Dish, Many Stories podcast, the show that aims to amplify the stories of these lands, now known as Hamilton, and the Indigenous peoples who have historically and currently live on these lands. Today, I will share my story, who I am, where I come from, and what Hamilton means to me, and why it is important for me to share these stories. We'll also explore these lands and examine place names of these lands using Indigenous languages. We will hear from our guest for this episode, Sonia Hill, who is Mohawk and Lebanese and resides in Hamilton. They will share their thoughts about place names and about Indigenous languages being used for place names in Hamilton. And they will share a bit about the work that they are doing in the city. Hi, Miigwech, Yahweh for joining us. So 20 years ago, I was 19 years old and I was living in the city of Regina. That's where I was born and raised in Regina, Saskatchewan, in Treaty 4. I am a Nehiao Esqueo, a Plains Cree woman. And during that time that I was living there, I was really unsure of who I was and what I wanted out of life. My mom was experiencing a similar feeling for different reasons and had left Regina to find herself. Long story short, she moved around from California to Georgia, and then she ended up in Toronto, and shortly after, she did move to Hamilton. At the time, Hamilton was a much cheaper city to live in, although that's a whole different story now. Shortly after she began to set her roots here in the Still City, my sister and I followed. Before understanding what Hamilton has become for me and what Hamilton has given me, I think it's really important to understand what growing up as a First Nations person, as a First Nations girl in a prairie city took for me. At the earliest age that I can remember of 5, I experienced racism. I remember being called names by other 5-year-olds. It was very apparent that I was different than them and not well liked because of that difference. Growing up, often asked if I was on welfare, usually from a tone that was very looking down on me. And multiple times my family was on welfare. Often excluded from birthday parties, many assumptions about my own personal alcohol use, especially as I came into teenagehood. The list goes on. The city of Regina took away my identity as a Nehiao person. I had so much internalized racism. I really hated being Native. I hated that my skin was brown. I often used box hair dye to try to change the color of my hair. It would always end up awful, but I was trying to erase the features that were identifiable as Native, like my dark brown hair. Growing up Native in the prairies took away my sense of pride as an Indigenous person. It took away my sense of community and belonging. I was always trying so hard to fit in with my white friends and trying to stay away from Indigenous community because of the shame I felt. But no matter what I did, I didn't fit in with my peers, and I often felt lost. I chose to move to Hamilton because this is where my mom was, and I knew that she would expect me to be doing more with my life. She would want me to consider post-secondary, rather than what I was doing, which is spending a lot of time at my cousin's apartment and a lot of self-destructive behaviors. So I spent 42 hours on a Greyhound with a box of my belongings, and I moved out this way. As I pulled into Toronto, I looked around at all these giant skyscrapers everywhere and I began to cry. I wondered, what was I doing here? This was such a giant, fast-moving city. A scared prairie girl like myself, metropolis of a city. And then when I finally made it into Hamilton, Hamilton felt just as big as Toronto. And I was really almost regretting my choices of moving out this way. As I began to settle into Hamilton, I can tell you right off the hop, I didn't even like it. I often heard people on the bus say that Hamilton was dirty and the armpit of Southern Ontario, and I believed it. I found the city sad because during those early days that I was here, there's many layoffs happening at the steel factories, leaving many workers who suddenly had no jobs and thought they had minimal options for new beginnings. I also had trouble meeting people. I was very, very shy, didn't feel like I belonged here, which wasn't an uncommon feeling for me. I was no longer in high school, so I wasn't forced to go to school to where I could potentially meet new people. I didn't have a job yet, so I didn't meet coworkers. Social media was not what it is now, so it was harder to connect with people who were located close to you. Even then, though, like meeting people online was still very taboo. I was extremely lonely, and I thought the only thing I could do was to quickly try to find a job so I can save up money and move back home. And that task proved to be way harder than I expected it to be. Especially since like about the first 300 resumes I had put all over this city had the wrong phone number on it, so I was not getting any phone calls back. These are my humble beginnings in Hamilton and trying to understand this place and my place within it. Spoiler alert, I never left. Eventually, I was able to find some work, make a few friends here and there, and I've even had the odd romance. There came a turning point, though, for my sense of belonging, which I did not know then what it would mean to me. Through encouragement of my mom, I had decided to apply to Mohawk College. I didn't even know what I wanted to be when I grew up, but I thought perhaps something helping people or working with kids, so I applied to early childhood education and the child and youth worker programs. When you apply to college, there's usually get 3 choices to one college. So I wasn't about to leave that third choice blank, and I flipped through that calendar probably 100 times until I could find something that I could put in that last spot. And I came across a program called Native Community Care Counseling and Development. Now, I was in my early 20s, still very unsure of who I was, especially as an Indigenous person. And I thought to myself, was this an opportunity to connect to something that I spent so much time hiding from? Perhaps it was. And so I put it as my third choice. When I received the envelope from Mohawk in the mail, I wasn't sure what to expect it to say inside. I'd always been a fairly decent student who with little effort could receive decent marks, so I knew my high school grades were not terrible, but they weren't that great either because, let's be honest, I didn't put a lot of effort into high school either. I was waitlisted for my first 2 programs of choice, but I was accepted into that Native Community Care program. And I was unsure of what being waitlisted would mean if I decided to wait for those programs. I had so many questions like how long would I have to wait? How many people were on the wait list before me? What if that wait list never opened up to me? And if I put all my eggs into those baskets and didn't accept the offer from the Native program, and then I didn't get an offer from those programs and stayed on the wait list, that would mean a whole nother year of waiting for the next admission cycle. So I decided, let's just go with it. Let's go with the program that wants me. And this is where real transformation of myself, my identity, my community, and sense of belonging really began. Within the program, I started to learn about the colonial history of this country, of residential schools, of the 60s CUPE, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, creation stories, Indigenous communities, and so much more. I began to understand my family and the impacts of the trauma Indigenous peoples faced. The staff and the faculty of the program not only taught us this course material, but they loved us. They cared for us. They fed us. They took us to community events. They checked in on us. They advocated for us. The list goes on. I suddenly had a community. People who had similar experiences as me, looked like me, understood some of the issues within my family and my trauma. I was right where I needed to be, building a community for myself, expanding my kinship network, and learning my role as an Indigenous woman in this community. Since completing this program, I continue to be committed to lifelong learning. I completed my first undergraduate degree in Aboriginal adult education at Brock University. I will soon complete my second degree in Indigenous Studies at McMaster University, and in the fall, I will be joining the Masters of Arts in Social Justice and Community Engagement at Laurier. I've worked within the urban Indigenous community for the past 16 years in various organizations, and I continue to work with Indigenous organizations, and currently I'm working with a national org. I have 2 teenagers who were born in the city, were raised in the city, and on these lands. Not a day goes by that I do not think about how receiving that acceptance letter from Mohawk was one of the best things that could have ever happened to me. I have kinship networks within the city of Hamilton and beyond. My sons walk tall with so much pride in who they are as First Nations men. We participate in ceremonies. We participate in language reclamation. We do community work. We have community and belonging. So let's lay a little bit of baseline information. What is Hamilton? Where is Hamilton? So here's the quick and dirty of the city of Hamilton. It is located on the western end of Lake Ontario, which is one of the 6 Great Lakes. Loyalists began settling here in 1778 after fleeing the American Revolution. The city is named after a Canadian-born man, George Hamilton, who founded the city in 1815. The city began being laid out between the waterfront to the north and the Niagara Escarpment to the south. George Hamilton was born in Queenston Heights, served as a captain of the Niagara Light Dragoons in the War of 1812. He was educated in Edinburgh, Scotland. He had a mind for business. He was known as a great Canadian merchant and a politician. That's about all the history that I want to share about Hamilton, because I feel this is a story that is widely shared. Some other things when we think about Hamilton is it's an industrial center, one of the leading exporters of steel and iron. It's a financial hub. There's an extensive fruit growing district. Some of the landmarks that are related to Hamilton that are widely known are McMaster University, the Royal Botanical Gardens, the Battlefield Monument, the Canadian Football League Hall of Fame, and we're home to the Hamilton Tiger Cats. And these are pretty well-known stories, monuments within Hamilton. And I think that most of us who are probably listening are aware of some of these things. But what I want to go into with this podcast are the things we're not aware of. You know, in recent years with land acknowledgements coming out, you may be more familiar now with the nations whose traditional territories these lands sit on. But do you know much more than that? I don't know, and I'm hoping that I can introduce some new information to help Hamiltonians, all of us. I mean, I learned a lot preparing for this podcast, that we can all continue learning and continue supporting, bringing more awareness and understanding and broadening the narrative, as I think often through history, there is too much of one side of the story being told, and I think we really need to work on changing that and getting other perspectives of history, other histories, the stories that are there that are missing out of our textbooks and our education system for so long. So I'm hoping that will help accomplish some of that. So one of the things that I really wanted to think about was land and place names in languages. So I know within Indigenous languages, and it varies from language to language, that the words that are used within the language are often very descriptive. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to know what were the place names of some of the places around here, like Lake Ontario, or the land itself. Was there a name for it, or all those different things, and then what does that translation to? I just find it really interesting. And what would it mean if we started using those, whether we use them unofficially or officially? So one of the place names of this area comes from the neutral peoples who were early Indigenous nations that lived on these lands, and they called this area Attiwondaronia. So we're going to have a guest on in a bit to talk more about place names in the language. But yeah, I'm really interested in knowing what the nations would have called this place and what that would mean if we were to reclaim these place names. There's a policy brief by the Yellowhead Institute that talks about Indigenous place names, authored by Gray and Ruck. They identified that there's much work being done across these lands, meaning Canada, to restore place names and revitalize the language after colonial policies and laws sought to eradicate them. And as we see more and more people introducing themselves, Indigenous peoples, in their language, it often includes sharing the traditional territories that they're from and where they live now if it is different. And we're seeing more Indigenous peoples use place names like Takaronto as opposed to Toronto, the Mohawk word for where the trees are standing in the water. Gray and Ruck state that colonial history of place names includes bringing over some variations of place names from Europe, also using butchered versions of Indigenous place names that were transformed for easier pronunciation. And of course, some place names are named after the colonizers themselves. Christy Belcourt wrote an essay where she said that Canada likes to use these Indigenous roots within place names as a way of, it makes them feel good that they're acknowledging Indigenous history and Indigenous peoples through these place names, as long as it doesn't require acknowledging the atrocities experienced by Indigenous peoples through the colonial project. It's a real feel-good thing. There are anglicized versions of these place names, like Ottawa, Ontario, Saskatchewan. Those come from the language, but they've been changed and transformed, and they're not actually in the language, really. The City of Hamilton has been working with urban Indigenous partners to develop an urban Indigenous strategy. The strategy is a response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which was the final report was released in 2015. And through the development of the strategy, there are 17 of the 94 calls to action in the TRC that were identified as being applicable to municipalities. So Hamilton, the City of Hamilton, has been actively working with Indigenous partners as active partners in reconciliation to develop the strategy and implement it. Within the strategy, there are key objectives, principles, commitments, and work dedicated to commemoration, acknowledging Indigenous histories and presence. Within the strategy, it does lay out some key objectives to promote a greater understanding among all Hamiltonians through public education on the histories and contributions of Indigenous peoples. Other key directions that come out is acknowledgement of traditional Indigenous territory in Hamilton. It should be practiced across the city, and the city needs to demonstrate this acknowledgement beyond words. The City of Hamilton can do more visually to represent the historic and continuing presence of Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous stories and languages need to be seen as part of Hamilton's heritage. So if we were to start using place names officially or unofficially within Hamilton, I wonder, how would that impact our Hamilton community? How would that impact Indigenous Hamilton community? Would there be resistance from non-Indigenous community members? But how beautiful would it be for Indigenous peoples to see themselves reflected in the landscape that is our city? Would it be more meaningful than those rote and bland land acknowledgements that are said before events? Supporting Indigenous language revitalization by bringing language into relevant everyday use. In the policy brief I mentioned by Gray and Ruck, they also discussed Bill C-91, an act that was passed in 2019 by the House of Commons, which respects Indigenous languages and is geared towards programs and service delivery that support language revitalization. Now, this act doesn't specifically look at place names, but if taken seriously, this could mean Indigenous languages would be more relevant and spoken and reflected in the world around us. So the renaming of places, landmarks, and monuments within Hamilton would contribute to elevating the narrative of Indigenous peoples, the histories, contributions, and present-day existence. Indigenous peoples will see themselves reflected in the city and have a greater sense of pride, not only as a Hamiltonian, but as an Indigenous person. And think about Indigenous youth and how they will see themselves represented around this city. And when we know historically how many racist mascots have been out there and, think about the difference of a racist mascot versus, authentic Indigenous led language and place names, that difference that it could mean to Indigenous youth. So I continue to wonder how these changes in the landscape of an urban place to acknowledge Indigenous peoples, languages, histories, and presence and relationships to this land can be amplified and supported. There are many nations that utilize these lands prior to settlement and contact from Europeans. The Wendat, the Neutral Nation, the Erie, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee nations all utilize these lands. Not to mention other nations, like various creatures, birds, insects, plants. When we look at Indigenous ways of being and knowing and in relation, our non-human counterparts that we share this space with have just as much of a relevance and a place within our world and within these lands. It feels really inappropriate not to acknowledge these other beings, not just humans that use these lands to live, to gain sustenance. This is a shared space. The Neutral Nation referred to this district of land as Attiwondaronia, and the Neutral Nation is called the Neutral Nation, and that's an English term for them, because they decided not to engage in the different conflicts that were happening in the area. But there are other nations that have terms for this area, and it'd be really interesting to see what that would mean to have those terms reflected in our city, to see Indigenous peoples and Indigenous languages being a part of the story, because the story of settlement and what's captured usually and taught through history is just that. It's the history of settlement, and often leaves out much of the story of the Indigenous nations that live and continue to live on these lands. So I'm very excited that we have a guest on this first episode. I've invited Sonia Hill to talk about this and place names and share some of the place names that they use in the city. And Sonia is going to introduce themselves, so I'm not going to give much more of an intro to that. So I hope you enjoy listening to my conversation with Sonia. Thanks again so much for being here. I think I'd like just to start by allowing you to introduce yourself, however you want to do that.
Hi, my name is Sonia Hill. I'm Mohawk from Six Nations and Lebanese. My pronouns are they, them. I was born and raised in Hamilton, Ontario. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. This is super exciting.
Yeah, so as I said in my email, I'm just doing some research in that and seeing this. There's some really great work happening in other places, like in Toronto, and various places all over. But I don't see it so much in Hamilton. But through actually, it was kind of inspired by some of the work you've been doing with some of the program and how you use place names naturally. So I was like, oh, I need to explore that a little bit more. So that's one of the reasons why I was like, oh, Sonia is a perfect person to invite to talk about this, because I was really interested in having somebody that lives or has spent a good portion of their life in Hamilton. Just because I think that's really more meaningful to when you're directly connected, and if you were to see these place names around more often, what that would mean to you versus somebody who's like doesn't come to the city very often. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so like you kind of mentioned Kahnekanoron a little bit, and Kahnekanoron is a program that I've been coordinating and kind of founded in 2017, and it's been running since 2018 under the Indigenous Sustenance Reclamation Network, which is essentially a network of programs that exists to give access to and increase access to traditional teachings and practices with regards to our medicines and our foods as Ungwe as Indigenous people in the city. So right now, actually, we're working on onboarding a third program with an ISRN, which will be at Six Nations. So that's pretty cool that we're kind of going from just being exclusively serving urban Indigenous folks to also now having a res-based program is really cool. So basically, Kahnekanoron is a program that focuses on reconnecting urban Ungwe urban Indigenous folks in and around Hamilton, Ontario, with like food and medicine teachings and practices. Um, it's existed since 2018, and it's had major shifts due to COVID in the last couple of years. So in the first couple of years, it was like solely in person, and so we would come together as a group of like primarily folks from Hamilton, since it was in person. We would come together as like urban Ungwe to learn about like our foods and our medicines, and like we were hosted by revitalizing our sustenance project quite a few times. Yeah, to be in their garden there, their community garden, and work directly with foods, directly with seeds. And then that's kind of shifted throughout COVID to be something that's more like held virtually. So like we've been able to do medicine exchanges, where like the group has like everybody sent in medicines, whatever their interpretation of that is, whether it's seeds, different medicine plants, even like crystals, all sorts of different things. And then basically we create packages and send it out to each person so that everybody's receiving something. And that's been kind of like a main point of each cycle for the last couple of years in COVID. And it's like made it that much more personal. And like it's really great to be able to still share and like come together in that really personal way, um, without having to be in person in a way. So yeah, basically like the
Mhm.
program exists to serve urban Ungwe. It was originally focused in Hamilton, but due to COVID has just expanded, which is really great. So yeah, that's kind of like a bit about the program.
Yeah, and as a participant of the program, it's been really a beautiful opportunity for myself as an urban person to connect with these things, and it's been quite nourishing. So I am internally grateful for the work that you do in this community to connecting us, and I love that it's expanding because I love the connections I have made personally with on reserve folk community and
Mhm.
going to revitalizing our sustenance and
Yeah.
that we aren't separate entities. We're still kin, and we can
Mhm.
still have relationships that are strong and nourished. So, thank you for sharing that. So yeah, I'd love to jump into some of the place names. I know when we were chatted briefly on email, I had shared some of the ones that I had come across while I was researching. Now, I am not
Mhm.
a very good language speaker, so I couldn't pronounce the words myself. But I'd love if you
Yeah.
have words that you use, whether they're the ones I shared or more or others, and talking about the language and what that means for you and using these place names.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, like, I'm just thinking, holy heck, there's, like, so much we could talk about, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So in the I well, I think the city is really cool because
Mhm.
I think there's one that describes the city as the place that stinks, and I think that's really funny and
Yeah.
really fitting for Hamilton. And I think there's another, but there's also another term. So
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh my god, I feel like I kind of, in my brain, have, erased the one for that translates to, like, "At where the town smells." Uh, yeah, that one's pretty funny, and it just, like, kind of always reminds me of, like, how, shady our ancestors could be in the humor. Like it's just kind of like a total jab at like the pollution of the city, but it's like fair, you know? Like it is it's a smelly town, what can
Mhm.
I say? Yeah, the word that we've used typically within the program and that I typically use myself is orogo, which translates to the place in the river or the ditch. So that basically refers to like the escarpment of Hamilton and how like the city itself, like the downtown core, sits beneath the escarpment. So like the place in the river or the ditch, like where the water is.
Mhm.
And to me, it's like really interesting how it's like um, the place in the ditch or like the place, like it just kind of to me also speaks to how there used to be a huge lake here. So like that's kind of how the escarpment was
Mhm.
created by this like giant ancient receding lake. So it used to come all the way up to the escarpment. So like the place in the river, the place in the ditch, to me kind of speaks to like how the water used to be all the way up there. And like, yeah, so I just think that's really cool, like that reference to like a river being here, because yeah, like the lake is here. But yeah, that's something that I've always found interesting. Now that I'm thinking about it too, it actually like that's the interpretation I've heard, but I've also heard like it could be place in the ravine, which is also very interesting because again, like just speaks to the
Mm.
escarpment and like the dip. But yeah, I really love that word for this place because to me, Hamilton means nothing. Like the word itself means nothing, and I just feel like if we
Mhm.
were to use Orogo, like the place in the ravine, the place in the ditch, the place in the river, like to me that just speaks a lot more to like where we're located and. It's like just to me, it feels a lot more personal than like the name of like the colonizer being attributed to this place.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just like when you're talking about that, I was just thinking like the history that is encompassed and embodied in that one term and how
Hmm.
beautiful it is. And when I was, preparing some of the research for the episode, and I had no idea where the term, like the name Hamilton came from. I figured it was after some guy, and of course it was,
Yeah.
and he's like some businessman and whatever. And again, that didn't really mean a whole lot to me.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
for
I get
sure.
it is part of like the settler history, but like there's more history to that. So I think that's really beautiful. And also just
Mhm.
commenting on the other term, like indigenous people, we're pretty funny, sarcastic people. So it makes a
Right?
lot of sense too that it holds a lot of that.
Yeah, for
um,
sure.
and what about the term for Lake Ontario?
Yeah, so,
Do you
like,
know
the
that
word that
one?
I know for that yeah, the word I know for that and that I, like, use for that is, Rio, which is, like, beautiful lake, and it yeah, like, this to me, this one's kind of, like, sad just because, like, growing up in
Mhm.
Hamilton, like, I always knew Lake Ontario as a place where you could never touch the water. And I remember my mom telling me
Mhm.
stories about how when she was a little kid, they actually used to be able to like swim in the lake, and then all of a sudden, when she was a teenager, like they weren't allowed to touch the water, and ever since then, they've never been able to touch the water. And seeing as like my mom's generation is the first generation on that side of my family to be separated from a reserved community, and then to just be like cut off from like the lake when you're a teenager would have been like really
Mhm.
like further displacing and like just deepens that like disconnection to like our natural relations for lack of a better term. I don't like the natural relations because it almost
Mhm.
places us as unnatural. But anyways, it just to me is like so
Right.
sad that like that connection to water is kind of like almost cut off because of all the pollution that's happened. So like the term itself does translate to like a beautiful lake, but to me it's kind of like it's super sad because even like the province is kind of like taken that name and like accepted it as their term for this place, but like there's like no respect for this lake that
Right.
is supposed to be a beautiful lake. So yeah.
Absolutely. And we think of our connection with water and how damaged that water is, it's certainly
Hmm.
disheartening and can be quite emotional when I really think about it.
Yeah, yeah. For me, it was normal growing up, like to not be able to touch the water, to like go to the beach with friends and like just sit on the sand and not touch the water. Like it was just known.
Mhm.
And then like to start like to get older and start traveling and stuff like that. And like there's so many beautiful places where you can just jump in and not think twice. Um, that was like almost like, whoa, we grew up in like kind of a post-apocalyptic existence, but it was like just normal for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other terms within this place that you use at all? If not, that's okay.
No, I don't think so, not quite. I'm also like a baby language learner, so yeah, place names are not something that are like so natural for me. Um,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And then just generally thinking if we were to like officially or at least use these names more frequently for this
Mhm.
place and continue to find other names for this place, even street names. When I was doing some of my research, the street that I live in, which I'm not going to say publicly on a public podcast, but when I was doing my research,
Yeah.
there's another street in another city that has the same name, and that city had found out that it derived from
Mhm.
an Anishinaabe name, and so there was like
Oh,
a whole thing.
interesting.
So like, there's probably other street
Mhm.
names that
Oh,
that
yeah.
have that as well. Um, So there
Mhm.
could be many opportunities to increase the use of Indigenous languages, like right here in our city. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on like what that would mean for Indigenous folks in the city, Indigenous youth, and seeing how these things
Yeah.
represented, or language people that are learning the language and seeing it
Mhm.
relevant in their world.
Yeah, honestly, I think that like seeing the language like in the city would just remind people that like we don't just exist on reserves. Like, yes, there are reserve communities, but there are also like we existed before that beyond the reserve and still continue to exist beyond the reserve. Like I'm thinking even like Mohawk Road in Hamilton actually loosely follows in like a old Mohawk hunting trail, like a wintertime trail. So I've always thought that was super
Oh,
interesting.
cool.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of wonder if maybe, like, that's too why we have, like, Mohawk College, we have all these, like, Mohawk references, which is kind of like, historically, this has been many people's homes, and, like, I always thought that was really
Hmm.
interesting. Just feel like it would remind, like, all people, like, all treaty people, whether they're, like, Ongwehongwe, like, Indigenous people or, like, Canadian settler folks, that, like, we are here and we've always been here. So, yeah, I just feel like seeing those
Hmm.
place names would remind people like, "Oh, wow, like this is literally all Indian land," Like this is not like we haven't been like erased from these
Yeah.
places. And these places don't disremember us. Like these places know us. Even if we're only like baby language learners and we're just getting to know these places again in like the terms of like our relations and our ancestors, like this land still remembers us, and that's even more an important thing as well. That like these places remember us. Like,
Absolutely.
yeah, I don't know. I'm just thinking because like, yeah, I grew up like for most part like up on like the East Mountain, and so like the escarpment was always like really like precious to me, and just learning that this whole place was named after like the fact that we fall below this escarpment and along this escarpment was just like, oh wow, that's so cool. Like my ancestors knew this place by this escarpment that I always played in. Like that to me was like really special.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think if we like can remember these places by our terms, it would like breathe that history back into the understanding of this city, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think that sounds really beautiful, and I love how you've phrased and said these things and breathed life into them. I think that maybe that's an initiative that Indigenous
Mhm.
folks in the city maybe want to take up in trying to reclaim these
Mhm.
names and places. And I think of even myself as somebody who's attempted some language. Like, I mean, I am
Yeah.
Cree, so my language isn't around here as often, but I do find if I'm not actively engaging in it, like I lose it a lot. So I
Yeah.
think if these terms were around more frequently and in our faces all the time, it makes it relevant. It makes it easier for language learners.
Yeah, there was actually like a project that the Indigenous Solidarity Working Group was starting to work on that was like basically like we wanted to go to different points in the city and kind of like apply QR codes that have like stories like place name stories, but also just um like Ongwehongwe histories about those places, because we were kind of like this all came
Oh,
from like
cool.
talks. Yeah, it came from like talks at Lamback where like we were like just talking about like how Hamilton like is has a lot of Haudenosaunee history, and like there's like specific medicines that grow in specific places, and that like so it's just like all these things like I felt for so long as like an urban Oklahoma person that like I almost was less than because I was in the city, and that like the city itself was almost disconnected from medicine. So to hear about all of these like medicines that grow in different places, like only like not only in Hamilton, but like very much concentrated in Hamilton was like really empowering, and like just thinking, wow, like our ancestors have so much history here, and I just feel like those stories are told so much like less often than like in other spaces, and it's
Yeah.
just to me is like really really beautiful, like all the history that's here, and I really hope that those stories can like get told on like a broader scale at some point, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the goal of like this project that I'm doing with the podcast is like I know that there's so much more to this, which I don't always like. I'm not the expert in that, but I'm learning as
Mhm.
I create these episodes. But like there is so much history to the lands that Hamilton now sits on, that and the community
Yeah.
of Indigenous folks. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm
Mhm.
hoping that I can be one of those people that help to amplify those stories, and then we'll continue. There'll be others that can continue to amplify them as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's really beautiful. Yeah. This
Mm.
is like the second research call I've had today. So I'm like, holy heck. I feel like there's a lot of like really cool stories that are being kind of like produced through this research. So I'm like just really thankful that like you chose this topic and excited for what this project becomes for you. So like looking forward to like, yeah, seeing what comes
Uh,
out of this. Thank you for involving me.
well, now I'll go to you for being here, and especially on such a short notice. And I know you've got a lot going on yourself. So I really appreciate your time and supporting me through this. And we can wrap it up here. So if there's any final thoughts, I'll give you the floor. If not, we can just say goodbye and see you later.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Yeah, again, like really excited to see what you create from this and looking forward to chatting soon. I guess I'll see you next Sunday.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will let you get back to Mango and Steve and whatever else. And I am again so grateful for your time.
Yay, no, thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Sources for the research for this episode include the Decolonial Atlas, the Urban Indigenous Strategy at the City of Hamilton, Reclaiming Indigenous Place Names, Policy Brief by Christina Gray and Daniel Ruck at the Yellowhead Institute, Reclaiming Ourselves, One Name at a Time by Christy Belcourt, Dictionary of Canadian Biography, the City of Hamilton website, and the Encyclopedia Britannica. And of course, our guest, Sonia Hill. Special thank you to Dr. Vanessa Watts at McMaster University for supervising my project, and for Claude Sepafora for post-production support. Hi, miigwech, miawe, thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at mzzz.jordan, J0RDAN, and on Twitter at Jordan_Carrier. Thanks again,